All right, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to SaberSim's Office Hours. Thank you for tuning into the stream today. We are coming up close to about a month now of hosting this show. So if you have been watching us live or the recordings throughout any part of that, thank you for supporting this and being a part of the community here, asking questions. I know we are still getting new viewers every single day watching live and watching the recordings. So if this is your first time tuning in, this is a live Q&A style show. Where we answer questions about DFS and about SaberSim from our users, questions that come in either through our support channels in our support inbox, our office hours channel on Slack, or YouTube chat as we're going through this live. So I host this live every weekday, Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. It's live for a reason. I want clarifying questions and follow-up questions when things are confusing or unclear. And we host it daily for a reason too, so that we can use the slates we have for that day to talk about some things, talk about strategy. I'm not sitting here giving picks. These office hours sessions are intended to still be useful after the slates that we are talking about have passed. But we do look at the slates that are going on that day to influence some of our conversation topics and things like that. So if you want to be involved in this show, our link to join our Slack will be in the description of this video once it is posted up on YouTube and, of course, no longer live. You can also email us, support@sabersim.com, and get a link to join our Slack community. That office hours channel on Slack is kind of where everything starts with this show. It is where the link to every day's individual show will be posted every morning. So it is the great place to start. If you watch the recordings of these and just want to have a question answered on stream, you can always just email us also at support@sabersim.com. Let us know what your question is and let us know that you'd like it to be answered on stream. I'm picking out a few of my favorites from our support inbox every day to talk about here on stream, but if there's something that you specifically want to hear discussed live, go ahead and let us know in your email. So it is Thursday here. We're getting into the middle of the round one of the US Open. So Max joined me on this stream yesterday to talk a little PGA DFS strategy, especially as it relates to the US Open, but not necessarily specific just to that tournament. So we talked for about an hour on overall PGA strategy, some really strong insights, some really great questions from the community. It was a great video. It is up now on YouTube along with all of our other strategy sessions. So if you missed that and you are a fan of golf DFS or are just interested in getting started, whether or not you played the US Open this week, if you did, good luck. I hope it helped building your lineups. But that content really should be evergreen and it should be useful for future golf tournaments too. So when we're all turning around next week and on Wednesday afternoon starting to build some of those golf lineups, go ahead and give that video a rewatch to get some overall strategy tips. We have continued to use the typically Thursday, yesterday it was Wednesday, but the Thursday time slot for this stream as a strategy session where we're diving deep into a specific contest type or sport type or concept overall. We have 4 of those, including the golf one we did yesterday, up on YouTube now. And I'm still getting questions into our inbox every day about some of those things. So if you haven't watched them yet and you are interested in esports DFS, NBA showdowns and short slates, or sports betting strategy, those are our 3 prior strategy sessions. They're all up on YouTube. There is an hour of content for each. Really great conversation, some awesome insights from Max, Danny, Andy, and myself. I highly recommend going and checking those out. So anyway, that pretty much does it for introductions here and housekeeping. I'm sure you guys have all heard the shtick before. I will go ahead and get us started. I will say a little light on questions overall today. I've got some interesting ones to dive into. In particular, I'm going to take a pretty deep dive into the sliders, because we did get a good question from Mike about sliders. But if you have been waiting to ask a question or just have something you want to talk about, great day to pop that into the Office Hours channel in Slack or into our YouTube chat, because we've got plenty of time to talk about whatever you guys would like today. So without much further ado, I am going to go ahead and get into this first question. Let me pull this up on stream here. Cool. So Mike asked, as far as the sliders for various contest sizes go, do you ever play around with them, or do you keep them standard? If you do play around with them, how many notches do you usually go up or down? This is a great question. We get this question a lot. Mike and I actually chatted a little bit yesterday afternoon, a little bit more about this. And since we have the time for it on today's show, I'm really going to use this opportunity to do a bit of a deep dive into SaberSim sliders. I'm going to start at some basic concepts, definitions about how the sliders work, move into some more intermediate concepts about how you can start to move them around and get different results, and then finally wrap up with a few advanced concepts, ways that you can use the sliders to do things that maybe will help aid your research as opposed to just build your final lineups. And then also a little bit of some interplay and some things to think about as you're using the sliders and get more familiar with them. So pretty excited to do this here. I'm going to go ahead and pull up SaberSim and we'll start talking here a little bit. Let me move my coffee so my arms don't start swinging here and I'll knock something over. Let me pull this up. All right, cool. We've got SaberSim up. We're looking at tonight's main slate of baseball. When you go ahead and open up the build settings, something to note, I think sometimes these get missed. We do have some basic definitions about what each of these sliders do. There are some very kind of, again, just a couple 1 or 2 line sentences about how these things work for somebody that's very new to the product. These are useful. I will also point out we have been working hard on our help center, which is at support.sabersim.com. We have a bunch of different sections in here. We have daily fantasy sports is where you're going to find a lot of this. There's a long article in here about build settings that does even provide some more information, including some of our older videos about correlation, ownership fade, things like that. I highly recommend checking this out. I'm not going to be able to cover everything we've got in this documentation here on stream today. So I definitely recommend it if you haven't checked it out already. We've been working hard on getting this up to date and as informational as possible. There's also an FAQs broken down by topic. So there is a section here, DFS Step 2 build rules, where we have a bunch of specific FAQs that come up about the sliders and build settings. But I'm going to go ahead and start talking about some of this thing. So again, starting with some basic concepts, right? Some basic definitions. What is correlation, right? Correlation refers to the rate at which one player's success not necessarily affects, but coincides with another player's success, right? So when you're looking at a specific player, we can actually, I'll do it with a batter here. We actually list these mathematical correlation values. I think these are coefficients of correlation that basically dictate the higher this number is, the more likely one player's success is or failure is likely to coincide or correlate to another player's success or failure, right? So we're looking at Aaron Judge here, typically bats second in the Yankees order, I think, and then followed by DJ LeMahieu, who, let's pull up this, typically bats first, right? And what we're seeing when we look at someone like Judge, we're seeing that those players are highly correlated. That makes sense, right? When LeMahieu gets a hit and then Aaron Judge comes up to bat, first of all, LeMahieu failed to get out and is on base, therefore maybe giving Judge an extra at-bat to begin with. But it also provides Judge an opportunity to knock an RBI in, right? So we can see that over the course of many, many game simulations, these two players' performance is correlated with one another. When Judge has a good game, it becomes a bit more likely that LeMahieu's having a good game and vice versa. Furthermore, when either player is having necessarily a poor game, the other player is probably more likely to have a poor game as well. In baseball, thinking about that, right? As a player gets out, they are taking potential at-bats away from the other players in the order, right? Players can also be negatively correlated. In baseball, a lot of times you'll see that negative correlation with a hitter and the opposing team's pitchers. That's probably the most obvious one. I think the probably most classic example of negative correlation is a team's quarterback in football versus the opposing team's defense, right? When the quarterback does well, it means that the defense is less likely to do well. So that is kind of what we think about with correlation. The next slider is ownership fade, right? The tooltip here will say that ownership fade essentially favors players with lower ownership projections overall. And avoids players with higher ownership projections overall. We recently pushed out 2 updates to ownership fade that are important. This is a little bit more intermediate or advanced definitions here. Ownership fade now is relative to the average ownership of a given position, right? So where this particularly comes into effect significantly is we are not looking at absolute ownership values across the entire field. If we look especially on a very small slate, like we have here for the early 2-game baseball slate we had today, when determining whether or not a pitcher is believed to be highly owned or lowly owned, it is relative to the average of the position, right? So I don't know what the exact mathematical average is between these 3 values, but I believe it is probably approximately maybe something close to Eli Morgan's ownership value, right? So from that perspective, from the builder's perspective, Jorge Lopez and Zach Gallen are both low-owned pitchers. Gossman would be a highly owned pitcher, and Eli Morgan would essentially kind of be a neutrally owned pitcher. Secondarily, ownership fade takes into account the standard deviation of a player's output. So it is more aggressive with fading players that have a wider range of outcomes, a bigger difference between their ceilings and floors and their mean, compared to a player that has, I actually think it's variance, if I want to be totally accurate. I don't think it's standard deviation. I think it's the variance of a player it takes into account. But basically, as a user, what you really need to know there is that players that are more variant, that have more volatility in their outputs, we will fade them and treat ownership more aggressively, right? And that makes sense of what we want to do. We want to fade chalk that has a higher chance of failure and play low-owned plays that have a higher chance of upside, whereas players that consistently are going to perform very well given their ownership is chalk that maybe sometimes we want to eat. So that's ownership fade. Smart diversity goes into how we determine the player's actual projection when we're building the lineups. So the higher your smart diversity is, the fewer total number of simulations we're going to use to determine every single player's projection when building every single lineup, right? So at a 0, this is best thought of on the extremes, right? At a 0 smart diversity, let's go back to the main slate. Every player's projection is going to be the mean projection, the average projection across every simulation we have. At 10 smart diversity, every player's projection when building actual lineups is going to come from a single game simulation of that player's game. So this is really easily demonstrated by pulling up the range of outcomes, right? We can see how we arrive at Shohei Ohtani's mean projection as a pitcher tonight, right? It is the average of all of these individual simulations that come up in the database of sims we have for that player. At a 10 smart diversity, we're going to pick out one single simulation, assign the projection that Ohtani scored in that game, and then decide if we want to use him in the lineup or not. This really allows us to, one, make lineups more diverse, which is a great component of that, but it also captures the player's real ranges of outcomes when building your lineups. So these 3 things all come into play and affect the way the lineups themselves are actually constructed, and also the way they are sorted if you're sorted by SaberScore in step 3. So what that means is that where a traditional optimizer is essentially going to look at 2 variables, it's going to look at a player's price and it's going to look at their mean projection, and it's going to try to pack in as much mean projection under a certain salary limit, right, across the lineup. Our builder is actually going to take into account the player's chosen projection based on the number of sims that we are using based on smart diversity, right? That's going to be the player's individual projection on whether or not they're used in a lineup. Correlation is going to be taken into account in terms of how that player correlates to other players in the lineup. And then an ownership calculation is going to be made based on how that player's ownership relates to the average ownership of his position and also that player's variance. And all of these factors are going to be combined into determining whether or not that player is actually used in the lineup. From there, when we actually build all these lineups, and we build the massive pool of lineups that come out. Saber Score is actually a tool of almost quality control. That's the reason we call step 3 quality control so often, of saying, okay, of the builder trying to do this process, say for 20 lineups, maybe 500 times, what are the best 20 across the metrics that were set by the sliders, right? So of this pool, it looks like it's probably going to build 500. We'll pull it up in a second. What are the highest, what are the most appropriately built lineups given these parameters for where we want correlation, ownership fade, and smart diversity to be, right? So that's why we have these Saber scores, right? So there's kind of two ways that the settings end up influencing your build. Is the first being the actual construction of the lineups themselves, and then also the way they are sorted in the post-build process. So let's see. So kind of still thinking around here more for beginners. I hope those definitions were clear, especially as somebody that's maybe a little bit unfamiliar with those concepts. But if they're not, let me know, and I'm happy to kind of walk back through those. But as a beginner, I would say this is probably one of the best things to just leave alone in your process, right? There is value to be added to your overall DFS process by starting to manipulate sliders and move them around. But as a beginner to the product or as a beginner to DFS, we do a lot of work back testing these. We change them often based on the data that we're seeing. The way this actually works is that we will take real slates that were played with actual contest types, contest entry limits and entrants and so on, and build thousands and thousands of lineups, and then look at what the expected value is at certain lineup settings over a long term, right? So there's serious work, there's serious thought put into these defaults. So as a beginner, we typically recommend for people to leave them alone. One thing that can be very useful in these sliders is actually using them as an educational tool for learning new sports, new contest types, or different slates, and how they impact the way we think about them, right? So say you have been playing NFL for years and you are interested in getting into MLB this season, and maybe tonight's your very first slate. You can immediately get some indication of the way this sport is played just by looking at what the default sliders are, right? Even if you had never even heard of baseball as a sport, you start to get familiar with some concepts, right? We can tell, especially if we're familiar with football, okay, this is a correlative sport. I want the impacts of correlation. Stacking is probably important here. Ownership fade, right, is at moderate. If you are somewhat familiar with SaberSim, you know that this generally doesn't get super high. We don't often have a lot of sky high ownership fades, but this one gets all the way up to high at some of the biggest contests. So we would say, chalk is probably pretty poor in baseball comparatively, and the field does a poor job of actually assessing value, and that's probably true. And smart diversity on most sports is going to be fairly high because we're playing GPPs. We want to have those high finishes. But you can also tell that this is a sport that relies on mean projection a little bit less compared to maybe something like NBA. And we really want to get those high ranges of outcomes, right? And you can do this even for different contests, right? If you have been a single entry player throughout your entire career, and you are looking at trying to break into some more mass multi-entry, you can see I typically maybe play single entry from 1,000 to 10,000. How should my lineups differ when I'm now maybe playing a 150 max? Well, you can see we drop correlation down a little bit. The reason why this is a little bit more of kind of an advanced concept here is that when you have more lineups in the contest and higher entry limits, the winning lineup closer approaches an optimal lineup, which is less often actually a true perfect stack. If you look at the mathematical optimal lineup after any slate, the odds of that being a very clean-cut 5-3 stack, even for a large baseball slate, actually can be pretty low. So that's the reason correlation drops down, but our ownership fade goes up and our smart diversity also goes up, right? We fade chalk a little more and we want higher upside lineups at the expense of average performance. So our smart diversity goes up. And it's a really interesting tool, right? I actually really just started getting into NHL this year. And one of the most useful things, I'm going to back this up to a typical slate maybe earlier from the middle of the season. Let's see what was going on. So this is only a little 5-gamer, but I actually, as a tool for learning how to play NHL successfully, one of the things I did is just started to explore what the sliders looked like. So we'll give this a second to come up, and you can see what actually stood out to me is that it was very reminiscent of what I was seeing in baseball. So I went on to apply some of the strategies that I use in my baseball process. I had a decent NHL season, not the best, not the worst. It was my first season really playing it hard. So excited for next year already. But I was able to use the default sliders to kind of create a sport comparison that got me a little ahead of the curve in terms of learning the game. So that's another reason why I recommend as a beginner to go ahead and leave those where they are. Let me see. Andrew, I see your question here. I will circle back around to that closer here to the end of the show about min salary. I will get back to that here. But I got my little note sheet here. I'm going to keep rolling through this stuff. Let's see. Okay, so the next step, I would say, really, once you've gotten kind of familiar with the sliders, you understand at least the basic definitions of what they are doing to your lineups. I think the best way that you can start to explore the impacts that they are actually having on your lineups is starting to play around with sliders set at extremes. So we always talk about the test build, right? I would recommend when you have time, this is something that it probably takes some time. This isn't something I'm going to go super deep into here on stream today because it will take some time. But on a slate that you're planning on playing and building lineups for, I recommend running a test build and getting an idea of just with default settings for a contest that you might be playing. A few things to look for. What do some of your highest exposed players look like? How are you interacting with some of the highest projected owned players on the slate? What kind of stack types are you building, and how often are you using different stack types? And that is probably a good start. And then I would say maybe finally how many players in total are in your pool, right? And then from there, start to play around with different slider settings at the extremes, right? So we can very easily take ownership fade up to 10. I'll do this for a few just so you can get an idea. And actually, as I was learning SaberSim years ago and getting familiar with the product, this is actually something I did. And I actually got a piece of paper and a pen out, and I started tracking these things just to get an idea of what it was actually doing to my lineups to move these sliders around, especially at the extremes, right? If you understand what a slider does at 0 and you understand what it does at 10, you often can understand what those middle grounds start to look like. But we just turned ownership fade up to 10, so let's go ahead and see what this looks like. And your expectation here, right, would be that the way we're handling the highest projected owned players has changed, right? But not dramatically so, right? You can see here, we have not completely faded every highly owned player in the pool, right? And what we're actually going to see is that we're still willing to eat some of the pitching chalk because of that pitchers have lower overall variance. We're okay having a little more chalk. What we've probably gone a little further away from is a lot of the batting chalk, right? Right? But not completely, right? Some of these Milwaukee Brewers at Coors are spectacularly good plays today. They're going to show up as great values. They're going to correlate really well with each other. We haven't faded them completely, but our overall exposure to them has probably gone down a little bit here. So you can see some of these, we were overwhelmingly 85% on some of these Milwaukee bats before, and we have come down with ownership fade at 10 to 50% on some of these batters, right? Let me double check that. Yeah. And then you can start to see some of these other, we have some Mets bats and some Atlanta bats that are coming in there. But our goal with the sliders overall, and why it can be such a useful practice to go through and do some of these things, is that we don't really want any necessarily slider set to completely break your build. And for the most part, it typically shouldn't, right? The vice versa to that is that there isn't that slider set that's out there, those perfect settings that are just like the print money button. That's another thing that I think comes up often. I think part of the reason why is that this particular menu is very intuitive at first glance. It's one of the things that maybe jumps out of the page at you as like a, hey, move these settings around. It's very easy to think that this is kind of where the magic happens. And the fact is that it really just isn't. I even saw the other day, I think Giant Squid was in the MLB channel after his 100K win, and someone asked, what sliders did you use? And even if that was available, even if he responded immediately, I think that you would find that there wasn't very much to learn there or to gain there. If Squid came back and said, oh, I used 9, 5, and 10, that's not necessarily an indication that 9, 5, and 10 are the optimal sliders to use, right? This is really just a portion of the process. And you can see, again, why running certain slider builds at the extremes. Let's just do this, for example. Let's try another one. We're going to do 10 correlation, 0 ownership fade, 10 smart diversity. And let's see what we're getting here. We were already getting really big stacks on our initial test build, so I don't know if we're going to see much bigger stacks. I think maybe it would have actually been more useful to turn correlation to 0 and run this build to see what we got. But this will still probably be useful enough to take a look at, right? But our expectation would be probably some bigger stacks, maybe a little bit more 5-3s than 5-2s, and probably a bigger player pool here as well, now that smart diversity has been cranked up a little bit. And these are things that have kind of become intuitive to me over time, getting familiar with these sliders, but they won't be often at first glance when you're first starting to play around with these. So remember to write these things down and mess around with it, right? We're looking at how we interact, how big is our total player pool, how we're interacting with the highest owned plays on the slate, what our exposure to some of our players in our player pool are at the cap, which goes into overall size of your player pool a little bit. Those two are a little similar, and what our stacks look like and how big they are, right? But you can see we made a jump here, moving smart diversity from 6 or 7 or whatever it was to 10 to 59 players in our pool, where our original build was, I think, 41. Oh, 40, right? So we've jumped from 40 to 59, I think is what it was. And that's because we're using single game simulations at this point, right? Our ranges of outcomes are wider across all of our players. So we're getting more players in the pool. So our lineups are going to be more diverse. There's going to be more of them. Our highest owned players are likely to be a little bit lower. Maybe this one isn't as useful as a signal. Maybe overall players in the pool is a little more useful. We have more pitchers too, right? That effect is going to be spread out. Let's look at our stacks. So our stacks didn't change that much, mostly because correlation is already pretty high. Also, this is more an advanced topic. I'll talk about this maybe in a moment. But at Smart Diversity 10, we actually start to have a less impact from correlation because, well, I'll just explain it now. When we are looking at single game simulations, specifically when Smart Diversity is at 10, the impact of the correlation slider can become a little bit muted or potentially even somewhat overkill, because in a single game sample, the effects of correlation are already taken into account, right? A game where maybe the Brewers go out and score 12 runs tonight, right? A single game outcome where that happens, if that's the outcome that's generating your projections for a certain lineup, you're going to get a ton of Brewers bats in there because it's a single game outcome and those players are actually correlated on the field with each other, right? This is maybe not the best example of a build to have run, but let's do one more here. I'm going to actually turn correlation all the way down to 0, and we'll see the impact of what that has on our stacks, right? Actually, I'm realizing now this is also probably going to have very little effect because of what I just said. Our smart diversity is at, we'll see what happens. Our smart diversity is at 10. Our correlation is at 0. So I expect that we're still going to get a lot of stacks because stacks are good in baseball, and when one team does well, a lot of batters from that team tend to do well. But let's see what it looks like. I'm curious while we're doing this. And then I'll move on to kind of some of the maybe more advanced concepts I want to talk about answer some questions, and then move us along. So. Okay, so you do see there are still some big stacks, right? These situations where 4 batters all happen to do well. But the priority of actually creating stacked lineups has dropped pretty significantly with correlation at 0, right? And again, we can kind of understand why this might be, right? So if we're just looking at some of these. So this is a little 2 stack, right? Where presumably both Walsh and Upton had great games, but there were a variety of players in their own individual game simulations that also had great games, and the builder didn't need to build a stacked lineup, right? So again, I would say play around with sliders as you are getting familiar with slider definitions. Play around with the sliders, especially look at them at the extremes. Run builds where a slider is at 0 and then 10. Look at your total number of players in your pool. Look at how you are dealing with the chalkiest players in the pool, the highest projected owned players, and look at your stacks and see how they're changing. Right, it's a very good way to get familiar with your what the sliders are actually doing. Right. From there, once you are starting to get very familiar with overall what the sliders are doing, I think you can start to break into some intentional manipulation of the sliders, right? And I will talk a little bit from what my personal strategy looks like with these. Also, some builds that you can do to aid in your research here. So, on average, the general slate, I am probably the least likely to move around the correlation slider. I think it's very well set. I think our correlation coefficients are very accurate and pretty precise. That is probably the slider I am least likely to use. Even if I am going in and set manual stacking rules, that is something I do a lot in baseball, particularly to pick out the specific teams that I want to actually 5-stack that night. Whatever they end up being, I will still leave correlation high because I want the effects of correlation to present themselves in those 5 stacks. I want correlation to be valued, and I want correlation to be valued across the rest of the lineup, right? And I think that those things are very well accomplished just by leaving the correlation slider alone. I would say the only potential spot where I maybe make some very minor changes to correlation is in basketball. Correlation is correlations are generally pretty weak in basketball. Let me go ahead and pull up a basketball slate, for example. They are weak taken across the entire range of simulations that we have for a player. So if we're looking at a past basketball slate from earlier this season, and we just click on any player, you're going to see that these correlations generally hover around 0. That's not to say there are no game outcomes where correlation plays no factor, right? If the game goes to overtime, players often end up becoming positively correlated with one another. And studs on a team often can be a little bit negatively correlated with each other, where like one of those players is likely to have a ceiling outcome or something like that at the expense of another, right? Like someone like LeBron and Anthony Davis may be positively correlated in that outcome where the game goes to double overtime, and negatively correlated in the outcome that is the typical game, which makes our correlations weak. So anyway, long story short, one thing I am likely to do is to just turn correlation off for NBA, especially if I'm already playing with a relatively higher smart diversity that's allowing some of those real game outcomes to creep into my lineups, right? So that's one spot I might move that. Smart diversity in general is probably, I'm going to skip ownership fade and come back to it. Smart diversity in general is probably the slider that I'm second most likely to move around, right? I guess that kind of makes it clear why I'm waiting for ownership fade. That's the one I move around the most. I typically am very unlikely to ever move smart diversity down, right? The reason why is the further you move smart diversity down, the higher your average performance of your lineups is going to be, but the lower your overall upside is, right? I generally like to play with a fairly wide pool. I want lineups that are typically somewhat, I guess I should say that first too. The further to the right smart diversity goes, the bigger your pool is going to be, the less exposed you are going to be to your most exposed players. And the further to the left, the tighter of a core you're going to play, and the more exposed you're going to be to some of those players. I like to play a little bit of a looser pool. I want to capture a lot of upside in my lineups. I'm not very concerned with min cashing whatsoever. I am more than fine having nights that I lose every lineup and have a bad average performance if I'm really capitalizing on upside. I would recommend in general to probably take smart diversity no lower than what the default value is for any given contest. I would probably only push it up if you are in general, a more risk neutral player, somebody that's more focused on upside. It's probably a good idea to turn this up. This is also definitely a slider that, I mean, at least maybe in a really small single entry contest, like 100-man, you can see smart diversity is going to start a little bit lower, but in like typical GPPs, the larger stuff, I would say it's difficult to go wrong here, to be completely honest. If you are okay with being playing a little more risky and seeking upside, there are many slates where I'm turning smart diversity all the way up to 10. If you are starting with a smart diversity value that is default and you want to start exploring, playing some builds and building some lineups where you're cranking it up a little bit, I would say start with splitting the difference between smart diversity at its default value and maxed out. So maybe if you're playing a 20 max, 5,000 people in it, and you want to start exploring some higher upside lineups, some wider player pools, maybe crank this up to 7 or 8 and see what impact that has on your lineups, right? That's a great place to start. Ownership fade is probably the slider that I'm most likely to change the most. It is also the slider that I'm most likely to change in either direction. One thing that's really useful that is important to remember when you're thinking about ownership, because correlation and smart diversity are baked naturally into the actual simulations, right? It's very easy to feel, at least for me, very confident of the data in that sense, right? Like, these are really baked heavily into the overall models for our sport, that I feel very confident in the overall accuracy and precision behind the coefficients of correlation that we see and the ranges of outcomes that we get for players. Ownership is difficult because you are predicting the activity of other people that the model maybe necessarily can mimic, right? The way we generate our ownership projections is by mimicking lineups that are likely to actually constructing thousands of lineups that actually could be made for a contest, right? And we feel very relatively confident about our ownership projections, but we're essentially trying to predict the behavior of players that aren't actually captured in the model itself, right? In other words, I am probably the least certain about ownership in terms of its overall accuracy compared to values of correlation or something like that, or the ranges of outcomes of players, right? Because DFS players, we're not modeling DFS players, really, right? This is not a model intended to predict the behavior of DFS players. It's a model intended to predict the behavior of baseball players. So when you are moving around the ownership fade slider, you are, one, making a statement of how much do I want ownership to affect my lineups? But secondarily, you're making a statement saying, how confident am I in the overall ownership projections, right? And that's true of every slider. But I think that confidence for me is just a little bit easier to write off. If I put correlation on very high, I'm fine saying, one, yes, I want very highly correlated lineups, and I'm very highly confident in the correlation values. For ownership fade, and I think this is also part of the reason why our ownership fade generally taps out on most defaults at around 5 or maybe 6. If you put it much higher, or get to like very high, you're making a statement that, one, I want ownership to be very highly taken into account when building my lineups, but also by extension, I'm very highly confident of the ownership values that we have. So that is important to be aware of when you are moving this thing around, and balance it against your level of confidence with ownership. If you are going in and researching the slate heavily and looking at Vegas and looking at a bunch of signals and moving ownership around, right? We even talked about that for our PGA strategy session yesterday, ways you can study the industry and get value out of updating ownership. And you've really fine-tuned ownership and you are very highly confident in your ownership projections. It's a spot where you can justify maybe creeping this up a little bit. If you are not, or in particular, if you are looking at something like a smaller slate, right? Small slates and showdowns and things like that can actually be very hard to start predicting ownership, because the players overall condense, right? The impacts of missing or being wrong on a player, in terms of how you are projecting their ownership, are exaggerated. And you can see even on a smaller slate like this, right? Our ownership fade is still kind of tapping out at around high. So that's a big factor. I would also say another component of how I'm deciding whether or not to use, where I want to use my ownership fade slider, is, we've talked about this before, is I will do a test build with a very specific set of settings. And that is correlation left alone, ownership fade at 0, right? So a neutral ownership fade build, and smart diversity at 10. And I will crank this up. Actually, let's do a 150 max. I will crank this up. Smart diversity at very high. I will build 150. We'll let this build for a second here just so we can show this off. And what this is going to do is it's going to show us a massive pool. Sometimes I'll even look beyond just the 150 and look at the entire pool of 1,500. It's going to build you a massive pool of lineups that basically capture all of the not all of, to be completely honest, but many, a large pool of viable lineups that you could play for that contest if ownership was completely not a concern, right? And then I will ask myself, based on kind of my understanding of the slate, where I think the field is going to go. One way we will do that, and I'll pull it up as soon as the build's done. We've talked about this a lot on stream. One way I like to accomplish that is looking at Vegas lines, right? I think the most popular stacks most nights often become the highest implied totals on Vegas. And just start to get an idea of, left to its own devices with no ownership concerns, what kind of lineups does SaberSim want to build? From there, you can kind of combine that with your understanding of the slate using our ownership projections, first of all, and Vegas and other signals, and maybe what you're hearing around the industry in terms of what's likely to be popular, and kind of decide on a case-by-case basis how much ownership you want to fade. Again, more advanced concept here, right? I'm talking about something that requires a little intuition, something that may not just jump off the page to somebody that's new to this. So if you are unfamiliar with ownership or not very sure of where you want that slider to be to start, leave it where it is. This isn't something you have to do. This isn't a spot where I would go to as the first place I wanted to add value to my process. But if you're already comfortable with the idea of adjusting your projections, managing your exposures in step 3, and are looking to squeeze out a little bit more value into your process, this is kind of the part where you can start to work in selectively moving your sliders around to fit the slate, right? And this will be very slate dependent. There are going to be times where SaberSim already naturally disagrees with the field quite a bit, and there's going to be times where it doesn't. You can see right off the bat, Milwaukee and Colorado are our most 2 popular stacks amongst our 150. If we look at our Vegas board, I don't even need to do this. I can already tell you, those are going to be the most chalky teams on the slate tonight, right? Almost certainly. Well, actually, I am maybe a little bit surprised. I still think they are likely to be very chalky. They're playing at Coors. I think the Brewers are likely to be the chalkiest team, but there are a lot of other teams that have some high implied totals here. So maybe not so much. From there, another interesting tool is to look at our ownership projections again. We'll look at all batters. So SaberSim thinks that Milwaukee is likely to be the chalkiest stack. Colorado probably secondarily from there. Then we start to see some of the Braves, Mets, some of these other teams. So if I was playing the slate and looking at this, this would indicate to me that I think I want ownership fade a little bit higher tonight, right? I don't typically like to play the chalkiest stack. I don't think you typically should. This would indicate to me that we probably need a little bit more ownership fade in our build for tonight. But let's say, for example, we ran this and our most popular stack we were getting was a team like we were getting a lot of maybe Toronto or Angels or Yankees, teams that I think are all likely to be fairly popular. Again, this is just really, it's a little before 1 o'clock here, Mountain Time. I know the slate's a long way away, so I'm not making a statement of where I actually think the chalk is going to end up tonight, but just looking right now, right, how I see the slate breaking out. Or even more so, right? Like, let's say we were getting, so you can see we do get a little bit of like White Sox and Cardinals. Like those teams are probably very likely to not be very chalky tonight. If we were getting a ton of those, maybe those are teams that maybe you don't even need to adjust ownership fade at all, right? The last time I talked about this on stream, we actually ran a build like this. There was no Coors on the slate, and that's exactly what happened. Our 3 chalkiest stacks were teams that I think the field is not even going to play, and I even said on stream, I think you could justify having a 0 ownership fade build on that particular night. So it is very slate dependent. Let's see. We're moving right along here. I've been talking about sliders for 45 minutes. We're cruising right along. I'm going to go ahead and talk about a couple FAQs that we get about sliders a lot. I think I've already mentioned some of these. And then I will circle around. I'll make sure I get Andrew, your question answered. And that's the only question that's come in today. So been a relatively quiet day here, but I've had fun talking about sliders. Hopefully this is useful for folks. So a couple FAQs here, frequently asked questions about the sliders that come in. One is, what should I do if I'm playing something that doesn't fit neatly into the defaults? As a beginner, I know FanDuel has a lot of like 7 max and 10 max contests. You can look and see, and what you'll probably find is that the difference between most of these isn't going to be massive. And once you have started to build slider sets just to practice at the extremes and you get familiar with the overall impacts, you'll realize that that's not going to have a massive effect on your overall lineups being in between or at either of the options that bookend what you're actually playing, right? So say we're playing a 7 or a 10 max, something in between a 3 and a 20. There's nothing wrong with setting the sliders at 3, right? You're going to get slightly chalkier lineups with slightly lower upside, but higher chance to min cash. And at 20, you're going to get slightly more ownership faded lineups with a little bit of higher upside, right? And anywhere in between those values is also fine too. And again, once you're familiar with what happens with ownership fade at 0 and 10 and smart diversity at 0 and 10, you're going to realize that there's not really, that's not making or breaking your lineup construction overall for the slate, right? There's not one that was right and one that was wrong. Another very common question is, if you're playing many contests, very different contest types, should you build one build at one set of sliders for every individual contest that you're playing? Or should you use some kind of average or something like that? That really depends a lot on more of what your lineup portfolio, what you want your lineup portfolio to look like. You can look at the contests that have the highest number of entries overall and build using lineup settings that fit that contest. You can look at where you've invested the most money and use lineup settings that, or build settings that fit that contest. Or it's totally fine to build different lineups for every single individual contest type you're playing. And from there, use something like our entry editor add-on, which is really useful for matching those up and getting those in the right contests. So there's not really a wrong answer there. But I would say definitely a good place to start is just look at where you're invested, like where you've actually invested the most money, and make sure that you're not sacrificing those lineups for something else, right? Even in the example, let's say you're playing the quarter jukebox, right, which is 20 entry max. That's $5 to max, but you're also playing one $10 single entry. There's a little bit of a value judgment there where, yes, on one hand, you have 20 lineups that are going to be built using theoretically 20 max contests, right? 6-4-7, and then one lineup that would theoretically be built with the single entry setting, probably a fewer entries. So that's 7-2-4, right? One is $10, one is $5. Again, I don't think you can really do something wrong necessarily here. I think either of these slider values are going to be valid, but just something to think about as you're putting your lineup portfolio together, deciding, do I want to be slightly more chalky in a bigger contest because I'm using some average default values for my sliders, or do I want to be a little bit more aggressive with fading chalk in a contest where maybe you don't necessarily need to so much? My general rule of thumb, very, very general rule of thumb, is I don't like turning things down. So I will, if I'm playing a huge suite of contests that night, I will often set these sliders at whatever my biggest contest is overall, and I'll live with playing a lineup that's maybe slightly over leveraged in terms of ownership in a single entry, because it still has a lot of that upside. So, and again, last FAQ, and I talked about this a little bit before here already, is a common one is what, especially after somebody has a big win, big GPP win, what sliders did you use for this? And I think that's actually where, let me look at the original question here and make sure that I really got to everything here. So the original question's written a little bit differently than that, but that is a common question, right? Especially after somebody gets a big win or it gets posted on Twitter. What were your sliders set at? And I would just push back on that as an idea, right? This is of step 1s, 2, and 3. Step 2 is probably the lowest on the overall poll of where you can add value to your process. It's the last one that I would say a user should really start dive into how they can add value in this spot. And there is no magic bink button slider settings for any sport or any contest out there, right? People that are winning are adding value to the product, typically in other ways, right? If there was that magic, this is the way I always think about it. If there was that magic set of sliders that just printed money out there, they would be the defaults, right? Because we test the shit out of these, pardon my language, and they are tested against real live contests that have happened in the past. So these are the defaults, to be completely honest, are very, very close to what that magic slider set already is, right? And people can add value a little bit by tweaking from there. So I've talked a ton about sliders. Gotten through all my notes here. I saw no other questions besides Andrew's come in, so I'm going to jump to Andrew's here in a second, but had a lot of fun talking about that. Mike, I think, mentioned he wasn't going to be able to catch this live, but would catch the recording. So if you've made it this far, Mike, I'm glad I made it interesting enough to watch 50 minutes or so of slider conversation. I think in your original notes, you had also asked me to be as sport neutral and contest size neutral as possible. So hopefully I've managed to do that. I'm going to jump over here to Andrew's question here with some of the limited time we have left. He said, default min salary is usually $59,250. Is there a reason it's pretty high? Wouldn't it be better to lower it? That way you can possibly get more correlated lineups that are lower salary. It will change. There are contests where it comes down a little bit. I think on golf, it gets down to 47,000. On showdowns, it gets really quite a bit low. On esports, if you haven't seen it, you wouldn't even believe this thing is like 30K lower than the max salary because pricing is really inefficient and there are profitable lineups that can be built there. So yeah, 20,000. You'll see that actually in reality, apart from, I would say, showdowns and really low, really small slates, this is actually a little bit of a false floor, meaning if you drop this to 0, so it was at 48.5, right? And let's just run a quick build. If you drop this to 0, typically you'll see that none of the builds actually end up with a salary lower than that anyway. With that said, I would say, I was just reading your other comment here to make sure I didn't repeat something. I would say, like, it's really just a protection against particularly low salary lineups. And I would say it's more of a protection for more beginner players. We want players to build high upside lineups that they can kind of understand and make sense to them. And very low salary lineups don't always jump off the page as being a good, highly correlated upside lineup to, users that may be unfamiliar or somewhat newer. So as an intermediate or more advanced user of SaberSim, I think it's totally fine to start dropping that down. Again, you're going to see a lot of times it's not going to have an impact. Like it just won't. I don't even know if we're going to get a single lineup. I'm sure in our pool of 500, we may have a lineup that's under that original salary floor. But it doesn't really look like there is in our initial pool of 20. And this is true of most sports where you see that set. So totally fine to take that out, especially if you are aware of what you're doing and aware of the fact that you may see a lineup that comes in at 47.5. Not to say that's a poor lineup. It's probably a good lineup. It's probably very unlikely to be duplicated. But just be aware of kind of what you're doing if you remove that min salary. So, but nothing wrong with that. Again, most of the time it's going to have very little impact, if at all. On showdowns and very small slates, it will start to have an impact. You can guarantee it. And again, on like a showdown, let's look at the showdown coming up here in about an hour. It will start much lower, right? We started at 35,000. So you're going to get lineups with a pretty low salary. If you drop this down even lower to 0, I would say it even becomes more increasingly likely that you are going to get lineups that are actually below that min salary floor. Not to say those are bad lineups. I think they're good. A lot of times what I do is remove that min salary floor. But you should be aware of what you're doing there. So the reason it is set where it is typically just so that we don't get exceedingly low salary lineups. You know, a lot of times there are, I mean, really, you can see it when you run a build, hundreds and thousands of viable lineups that actually work for a lot of these contests. So at the expense of a lineup with an extremely low salary, sometimes we would rather just play a lineup with a little bit of a higher salary in there, especially running something at default settings, right? Somebody that kind of just wants to go in, hit the button, build the lineups, and know that they have decent lineups for the contest. It makes sense to have some kind of salary floor in there. So that's kind of the basis for why it's there. But cool. Wow. 56 minutes in. That was a bit of a rush. That was fun. I had fun talking about sliders. I don't really see any other questions. It's been a relatively quiet show. I know there's at least a few of you guys watching here. So for those of you that have been watching along this whole time, thanks for tagging along with me. Of course, I know there are many of you that will be watching the recording of this later. So we appreciate you too. Thank you for tuning in. If you watch the recording of this and you have a question about something that came up on this show or any show, you can always email us, support@sabersim.com. Or if you're in the Slack, you can reach out in Slack in our Office Hours channel and ask for some clarification on maybe a specific point or something I brought up. I always watch these back to get them posted and timestamped up on YouTube immediately after signing off. And I feel like almost every video, there's something that I find that I said maybe a little bit confusing or not as clear as I intended. And I'm the one saying it. So I am sure as the viewer, there are some questions. So please, please, please do not hesitate to reach out and ask if you ever have a question about anything we talk about here on the stream. But with all that said, no other questions have come in here today. So I am probably just going to wrap us up. We'll be back again tomorrow on Friday. Another week is in the books here, 2 p.m. Eastern. So let me know of any questions you guys have in the meantime. Enjoy the US Open and we'll chat soon. All right. Thank you.